There is a particular feeling that hits you when you walk through a neighborhood you used to know and realize. Somewhere between the corner that's now a chain, and the building that's been rezoned, and the faces that are no longer familiar. That what you're walking through is no longer quite the same place. It isn't a dramatic feeling. Nobody announces it. There's no single morning you wake up and think, the dream I was sold about this city no longer applies to me. It happens in pieces, small decisions, delayed plans, conversations you have at dinner tables where someone mentions they're thinking about leaving, and nobody around the table tries to talk them out of it. New York City has always changed. That's part of its mythology. The Lower East Side, that was a Jewish immigrant neighborhood, became something else. The Harlem that defined a cultural renaissance became something else. The Soho that was a warehouse district became something else. Change is woven into this city's identity so thoroughly that most people assume the latest round of transformation is just another chapter in a very long story. But something about what is happening right now feels different from those earlier chapters. And if you look carefully at the evidence, not the headlines, not the political debates, just the quiet patterns that show up in the data and the daily lives of ordinary people, what you start to see is not just change. What you start to see is a city that is slowly becoming unrecognizable to the people who built it. In today's video, we are looking at 12 signs that the American dream, the idea that if you work hard and make reasonable choices, you can build a decent life in New York City, is fading. Not disappearing overnight. Not vanishing in a single dramatic moment, but fading. The way the light fades before you quite realize it has gotten dark. Sign number 12 is one that most people walk past every single day without stopping to think about what it means. It is the empty storefront. If you have spent any time in Manhattan, Brooklyn, or Queens in recent years, you have seen them. Windows covered in brown paper, cardboard taped over glass, a sign that says "Coming Soon" that has been there for 14 months. A space where a deli or a hardware store or a dry cleaner used to be, now dark and hollow. Most people glance and move on, attributing the vacancy to bad luck or slow economic recovery or the lingering effects of COVID. But the numbers tell a more complicated story. As of March 2025, New York City's citywide storefront vacancy rate was 11.4%, according to testimony from the Department of Small Business Services to the City Council. Manhattan alone had a vacancy rate of 14.2%. Brooklyn was at 11.9%. To put that in context, back in 2004, the citywide vacancy rate was around 4%. The problem has tripled over 2 decades, and in certain pockets of the city, it is far worse. Lower Manhattan, specifically Community District 1, which covers roughly 1.5 square miles around the financial district, recorded a vacancy rate of 22%, the highest of any of New York City's 59 community districts. In just the second quarter of 2025 alone, 8,400 small businesses closed in New York City. Now, the vacancy rate is not just an aesthetic problem. It is not simply about the visual unpleasantness of walking past empty windows. Each of those vacant storefronts represents jobs that no longer exist, tax revenue that is no longer collected, and a subtle erosion of the daily texture of urban life. The rhythm of knowing the person who owns the shop on the corner. The habit of stopping somewhere on the walk home. The small human transactions that hold a neighborhood together. According to the City Comptroller's office, in Lower Manhattan alone, vacant retail spaces represent an estimated 5,100 lost jobs and over $21 million in annual tax revenue simply not being generated. The reasons behind the vacancies are layered. In Brooklyn's most sought-after corridors, asking rents for retail space reached as high as $245 per square foot in 2024, up 40% from a year earlier. Commercial landlords, facing the possibility of attracting a wealthy chain tenant, often choose to let spaces sit vacant rather than accept lower rents from independent businesses. One city official put it directly, "If a bar can offer $10,000 per month, and a bodega can only pay $5,000, the landlord will wait. And so the bodega closes, and the windows go dark, and the neighborhood quietly loses something it cannot easily name or replace. But the next sign tells an even more personal story. Because when buildings stay empty, the people who used to depend on those businesses don't simply disappear. They have to go somewhere. Sign number 11 is the one that shows up in the data in a way that is almost too stark to fully absorb. New York City is losing its middle class, and it is losing them faster than any public conversation is really acknowledging. In 2025, New York City lost 113,000 more residents to other parts of the United States than it gained from them. A net domestic outmigration of over 100,000 people in a single year. According to the Citizens Budget Commission, which tracks this data through IRS filings and census records, that number was an increase from the 94,000 lost the year before. And the pattern of who is leaving has shifted in a way that should concern anyone who cares about what kind of city New York is becoming. During the pandemic years, the people leaving New York City were disproportionately high earners. People who could afford to work remotely from a house in the Hudson Valley or a condo in Florida. The assumption was that this was a temporary disruption, that the city's energy and opportunity would pull people back. And to some extent it did. In 2023, the city gained roughly 70,000 people. In 2024, it gained 163,000, though most of that was driven by international migration, including migrants and asylum seekers. By 2025, even that offsetting factor had diminished, as tighter federal immigration enforcement reduced international in-migration by 70%. But here is the part that does not receive nearly enough attention. By 2024, the data showed that the people leaving New York City were no longer primarily high-income residents. The heaviest departure was happening among households in the bottom 40% of incomes. Working-class New Yorkers, lower middle-income families, people who earn enough to survive but not enough to comfortably absorb the costs of the city, were the ones walking away in the largest numbers. The Citizens Budget Commission described this in language that is plain enough to repeat directly. The loss of working and middle-class residents likely reflects the high cost of living and perhaps the quality of services, including schools. It is a barometer of the challenges of raising a family in New York City. Millennials are leaving more than any other generation. Hispanic New Yorkers are leaving faster than white and black residents. Households with young children are twice as likely to leave, according to a 2024 report by the Fiscal Policy Institute, with more than a third citing housing unaffordability as a significant factor. These are not abstractions. These are the families that define what a city actually is. The teachers, the nurses, the tradespeople, the small business workers, the parents coaching Little League on Saturday mornings. And they are leaving. Where are they going? Most stay in the region: Long Island, Westchester, New Jersey, Connecticut. Some leave the region entirely, heading to Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and Texas. They are not disappearing. They are simply finding somewhere else to try to build the life that New York told them was possible here. And what they find, more often than not, is that they can actually afford it. But if you want to understand why so many people are reaching that decision, the next sign makes it very clear. Sign number 10 is the rent. The numbers here are almost impossible to fully communicate without standing in front of an actual lease. The rental vacancy rate in New York City fell to 1.4% in the triennial New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, released in February 2024, a multi-decade low. In 2017, it had been 3.6%. In 2021, during the pandemic disruption, it briefly rose to 4.5%. Then, it collapsed. A 1.4% vacancy rate means there is effectively no slack in the housing market. For the lowest rent apartments, the ones that working-class families actually need, the vacancy rate was 0.39%. That is not a typo. 39/100%. What happens when there is essentially no affordable housing available? Landlords have no incentive to lower rents, negotiate, or accommodate existing tenants. Families in rent-stabilized apartments try desperately to hold on to leases that they know can never be replaced. And the people who cannot find anything they can afford, they do what you do when you have no other option. They stay in dangerous apartments. They split a 2-bedroom among 6 people. They double up with relatives, or they enter the shelter system. New York City's cost of living is 69% higher than the national average. Nearly 50% of working-age households in the city cannot earn enough to meet basic living expenses. In 2024 alone, only 2,063 units of newly constructed rental housing were completed that were affordable to the city's over 820,000 lowest-income residents. 2,000 units. For a city of over 8 million people, for the people who need help most, the math does not come close to working. Meanwhile, the Bronx neighborhoods of Hunts Point, Morrisania, and Riverdale, neighborhoods where rent burden has been severe for decades, saw minimal affordable housing units constructed below 80% of area median income in 2024. The city's area median income is defined at $139th of $800 for a family. Many of the affordable units being built are technically affordable only to households earning 80% of that number or above. That still means a family earning over $111,000 a year. The people who actually cannot pay their rent are not being housed by these programs. And this next sign shows exactly what happens when they aren't. Sign number 9 is the shelter system, and what it quietly reveals about the families that have been failed by everything that came before. In March 2026, 66% of the people in New York City's Department of Homeless Services shelter system were members of families, including 32,050 children. Let that number sit for a moment. 32,000 children sleeping in shelters in New York City in a single month. According to the Coalition for the Homeless, more than 156,000 New York City school children experienced homelessness at some point during the 2024 to 2025 school year. That is 1 in 8 children attending city schools. Between January 2022 and January 2024, the shelter census in New York City more than doubled, rising from 45,343 people to 89,119. The overall number of homeless New Yorkers reached approximately 158,000 in 2024, representing about 1 in 5 of the nation's entire homeless population. New York State's rate of homelessness, 8 per 1,000 residents, was higher than every state except Hawaii and the District of Columbia. The primary cause, according to survey after survey of homeless families, is not mental illness, not addiction, not personal failure. The primary cause is the lack of affordable housing. Families describe being forced from their apartments by evictions, by rent increases they could not absorb, by housing conditions that became uninhabitable. They describe the impossible arithmetic of a city where the rent on a modest 2-bedroom can consume more than a family's entire monthly income. The shelter system itself has become a kind of parallel city within a city. On January 1st, 2025, more than 18,900 families with children were living in Department of Homeless Services shelters. Each night, average daily applications to the shelter system ran at 133 families per day throughout 2025. The single intake center where families with children can apply for emergency shelter, the Prevention Assistance and Temporary Housing Center in the Bronx, processes this volume every single day. And yet, at the same time, nearly 6,000 New York City Housing Authority apartments were sitting vacant in 2024, while over 240,000 families were waiting on the public housing wait list. The disconnect between supply and need, between what exists and who has access to it, is one of the quiet cruelties embedded in the way the city operates. But there is another sign that connects directly to this one. A sign that involves not just where families live, but the very decision to start a family at all. Sign number 8 is the disappearing child. not in a dramatic sense. In the quiet, cumulative sense of a city where young people are increasingly deciding that raising children here is something they cannot afford or sustain. The evidence shows up most clearly in the public school enrollment data. And what that data reveals is a long, slow decline that has been accelerating. New York City's public schools experienced their biggest enrollment drop in 4 years in the fall of 2025, a decline of approximately 22,000 students, or 2.4%, according to the Department of Education. Total K-12 enrollment fell to roughly 884,400 students. That number is already down more than 12% from its level 5 years ago. And according to a statistical forecasting report prepared for the New York City School Construction Authority, the decline is not expected to reverse. By 2034 to 2035, the city's public school enrollment is projected to fall to 721,251, a loss of 153,000 more students from where it stands today. Brooklyn is projected to lose 45,000 students over the next decade. Queens is expected to lose 43,000. The Bronx, 35,000. These are not small numbers. These are the children of the working and middle-class families who have quietly, without ceremony, concluded that New York City is no longer a place where they can afford to raise a family. The reasons are layered. Falling birth rates play a role. The exodus of families with children plays a larger one. Early childhood education cuts have compounded the problem. Since 2022, Mayor Adams cut an estimated $400 million from early childcare programs, with further cuts proposed in subsequent years. For families who were already stretched thin, the prospect of paying for childcare in a city where those programs had been reduced or eliminated, while also paying rents that consumed more than half their income, became a calculation that simply did not work. In Brooklyn, asking rents for retail and residential space continued to climb. On the Upper West Side, long considered a family-oriented neighborhood of the professional class, the pressures began to show. The street-level signs, fewer strollers on weekday mornings, fewer families at the playground, fewer lines at the elementary school after the bell. A city that cannot keep its families cannot sustain its future. And that leads directly to the next sign. Sign number 7 is what the departure of families does to the city's sense of community and shared identity. There is a quality that longtime New York residents talk about when they describe what the city used to feel like. A density of connection that existed not just in grand cultural institutions, but in the small, repeated encounters of neighborhood life. You knew the pharmacist. You recognized the couple who walked their dog past your stoop every morning. Your children went to school with the children of the family that ran the bodega on the corner. These were the invisible threads that made a collection of buildings into something that felt, genuinely, like a community. Those threads are harder to find now in many parts of the city. Not because people are less friendly or more isolated by temperament, but because the turnover rate in the population of New York City has made sustained community formation increasingly difficult. When the people who live on your block change every 2 or 3 years, when the neighbor who learned your name moves to Westchester, and the apartment is rented at a higher rate to someone who will be gone again in 18 months, the texture of daily life changes in ways that are real, but difficult to document. The demographic shifts are not random. According to the Citizens Budget Commission data, the outmigration has been particularly concentrated among Black and Hispanic residents, households with young children, and low to middle income families. In many neighborhoods in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens, the communities that built those places, that created the cultural identities those neighborhoods are now sold as tourist attractions, are being replaced by residents who arrived for an entirely different experience of the city. This is not a new observation. Gentrification has been discussed in New York City for decades, but the scale and speed of the current displacement, combined with the collapse of affordable housing supply, means that the communities being displaced have nowhere in the city to go. They are not moving to a different neighborhood in Brooklyn. They are leaving New York State entirely, and when they leave, they take something with them that cannot be rebuilt by investment or rezoning or any policy tool that a mayor or governor currently has at their disposal. They take the accumulated social fabric of decades. But if you want to understand one specific mechanism through which this displacement is accelerating, the next sign is essential. Sign number 6 is the Manhattan office building. And what has happened to it since the pandemic changed the way Americans work? There are roughly 420 million square feet of office space in Manhattan. As of the first quarter of 2025, the overall vacancy rate for that space had climbed to 23.3%, a figure that has remained above 20% for 4 consecutive years. Across Midtown, Lower Manhattan, and the corridors that used to fill with workers 5 days a week, more than 1 in 5 square feet of commercial space is empty. This matters for reasons that go beyond the real estate industry. The office ecosystem of a city like New York is not just about the people who sit at desks. It is about the coffee shop on the ground floor, the dry cleaner 2 blocks away, the lunch counter that served 1,200 people a day in 2019 and serves 400 now. When office occupancy drops by a quarter and stays there, every business that depended on the daily movement of office workers absorbs that loss. In Herald Square, retail asking rents were down 18% from 2024. In Times Square, down 9%. On the Upper West Side, down 8%. These are the neighborhoods that businesses used to fight to enter, willing to pay extraordinary premiums for the foot traffic. Now landlords in those same corridors are reducing their asking prices and still finding fewer takers. 26 commercial buildings in Manhattan had applied for conversion to residential use as of early 2025. A 2024 state program created financial incentives for these conversions, but the process is slow, expensive, and technically complicated. And the conversions that happen are often concentrated in Lower Manhattan, where the floor plates of older buildings happen to make residential conversion feasible. The result is a city center that looks increasingly fractured. Blocks where luxury condominiums occupy former office towers sit next to corridors of empty storefronts that used to thrive on the foot traffic of commuters who no longer come, and the workers who do come. The ones still commuting to offices in Manhattan are experiencing the city differently than they did a decade ago. Sign number 5 is the daily cost of simply getting around. On January 5, 2025, New York City launched congestion pricing, a toll system charging drivers $9 to enter Manhattan below 60th Street during designated hours. The stated goal was to reduce traffic and generate funding for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority's capital improvements. And by certain measures, it worked. Tunnel commute times improved significantly. Subway ridership increased by 7.7% in 2025, and the MTA reported on-time subway performance of 85.2% in May of that year, described as the best non-pandemic month in recorded history. But the story of congestion pricing is also a story about the cumulative weight of costs in New York City. For the commuter who drives into the city from a suburb in New Jersey or Long Island because they cannot afford to live closer to where they work, a $9 daily toll adds roughly $2,000 a year to the cost of employment. For a middle-income worker already stretched by housing costs, childcare, and the general inflation that has characterized the past several years, that number is not trivial. It is one more weight on a scale that many people are watching tip toward the decision to leave. The city asks its residents and visitors to absorb costs that compound in ways that are difficult to track individually, but crushing in their aggregate. The monthly Metro card for unlimited subway rides, the congestion toll, the parking permit if you own a car, the delivery surcharges that have been added to online orders entering the city, the property tax that flows into rents, the sales tax that is higher than virtually every comparable city in America. New York City's cost of living, at 69% above the national average, does not emerge from a single dramatic expense. It emerges from the accumulation of dozens of ordinary ones. And that brings us to a sign that connects everything together. One that shows up not in any single data point, but in a quiet shift in what people are buying. Or more accurately, what they are deciding not to buy anymore. Sign number 4 is the dream of home ownership, and how completely out of reach it has become for ordinary New Yorkers. Home ownership has always been the central metaphor of the American dream. The house you could call yours, the mortgage that builds equity rather than simply paying someone else's, the stake in a community that comes with owning a piece of it. In New York City, that dream was never easy. But there was a period, spanning roughly the second half of the 20th century, when it was achievable for people who worked steadily and saved carefully. The middle-income homeowner in Queens, in Brooklyn, in Staten Island, in the Bronx, that was a recognizable category of person. That category is now struggling to replenish itself. The rental vacancy rate of 1.4% that makes renting so precarious also reflects a deeper truth. There is not enough of any kind of housing in New York City, and the housing that exists to buy is priced at levels that require incomes far beyond what most working families earn. S&P Global Ratings noted in a 2024 analysis that New York City's cost of living is 69% above the national average, and that per capita personal income there was expected to decline to 90% of the national figure by 2026, meaning the gap between what the city costs and what its residents earn is actually widening. Conventional mortgage rates peaked at above 7% for 17 weeks in 2023. Those rates, combined with low inventory and prices that had risen through the pandemic, made homeownership a mathematical impossibility for an enormous share of the population. Families are responding to this reality with the only tool they have, which is delay. They delay buying. They delay having children. They delay committing to the city at all. And when they finally decide that the delays cannot continue, that they need a house, a yard, a school district, a sense of permanence, many of them are making that decision somewhere other than New York. But there is a sign that precedes all of this. A sign that exists, not in what people cannot afford, but in what is disappearing from the streets and the storefronts and the neighborhoods themselves. Sign number 3 is the slow erasure of the businesses that once defined what New York City actually felt like to live in. The independent restaurant that had been on the same block for 30 years. The tailor shop in Jackson Heights where the owner knew his customers' measurements without writing them down. The record store in the East Village. The hardware store in Flatbush, the Italian deli in Carroll Gardens, the Dominican salon in Washington Heights. These places were not just businesses. They were institutions. They were the physical evidence that a specific community of people had chosen to build something in a specific place. Party City closed 14 Long Island locations and filed for bankruptcy. Rite Aid shuttered all its remaining New York locations in 2025 after its second bankruptcy filing. Jo-Ann fabric stores closed their New York operations entirely. Bed Bath & Beyond was already gone. Forever 21 closed its mall locations in Riverhead, Lake Grove, Valley Stream, Bay Shore, Deer Park, and Garden City. Macy's announced plans to close 150 stores through the end of 2026, with at least 66 already shuttered in 2025. But these closures of major national chains are in some ways the less significant part of the story. What matters more, and is harder to count, is the quiet disappearance of the small and independent places that made each New York neighborhood distinct from every other New York neighborhood. Since 2020, nearly 12,700 small businesses that were operating have now become vacant storefronts. The comptroller's office has tracked this. The turnover is real. The businesses that replace them, when anything replaces them at all, tend to be chains that exist everywhere. The same coffee brand, the same fast casual format, the same pharmaceutical chain that has now consolidated its way into every commercial block in every American city. This is not a New York problem exclusively, but in New York, a city where the character of individual neighborhoods was one of the primary reasons people chose to live here rather than somewhere cheaper. The homogenization of the commercial landscape carries a particular weight. When a neighborhood loses the businesses that made it feel like itself, it loses something that attracts the next generation of residents who might have chosen to stay. Sign number 2 is the one that hits the hardest, and it is about children, not the children who are leaving with their families, as we discussed earlier, but the children who are still here and are sleeping in shelters. More than 156,000 school children in New York City experienced homelessness at some point during the 2024 to 2025 school year. 1 in 8 children attending city schools. These are not children from far away or from other circumstances. These are children who attend PS 187 in Washington Heights, who ride the D train to school in the Bronx, who are trying to do homework in a shelter in East New York or Mott Haven. There is a specific quality to this statistic that resists easy processing. A child in a shelter is a child who does not have a consistent place to do homework. A child whose school attendance is disrupted by the logistics of shelter life. A child who is growing up with an understanding of instability that no amount of later experience will fully overwrite. The research on the long-term effects of childhood homelessness is unambiguous. It affects educational outcomes, health outcomes, economic outcomes decades into the future. For context, between 1996 and 2017, New York City lost 1.1 million units of affordable housing. The consequences of that loss are not abstract. They are 32,000 children sleeping in shelters in a single month. They are 133 families showing up at a single intake center in the Bronx every day asking for help. They are 1 in 8 school children trying to navigate a system that was built for children who have stable homes. And the city's response, the programs, the conversions, the zoning changes, the incentives, while real and in some cases meaningful, has not come close to matching the scale of what has been lost or the speed at which the need is growing. In 2024, only 2,063 affordable rental units were completed that served the city's lowest income residents. For a city of over 8 million people, this is what fading looks like when it reaches all the way down to children. Sign number 1, the one that ties everything together, is the silence that follows. There is a particular silence that settles over a city when the people who built it decide they can no longer afford to stay. It does not happen loudly. It happens in small announcements at family dinners. We found a place in North Carolina. We're going to try Jersey. We just can't do it here anymore. It happens in the closing of a business that a family ran for a generation and cannot pass on to the next generation because the rent increase they received on renewal was higher than the revenue they generate. It happens in the elementary school classroom that has fewer students in it than it did last year, and fewer again than it did the year before. New York City's school-age population fell by 102,800 students during the 2 peak COVID school years, reaching 17 million by the 2022 to 23 school year. Since then, enrollment has risen only modestly. By 2034, it is projected to fall by another 153,000. Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, the boroughs where most working class and immigrant families have historically made their lives, will absorb the largest losses. The Citizens Budget Commission, in language that was both careful and bleak, summarized the situation this way. More New York City residents of all incomes, races, ethnicities, and ages have moved to other parts of the U.S. than moved in. Such broad-based domestic outmigration demonstrates that many differently situated New Yorkers no longer find New York City's value proposition compelling. Value proposition. It is a strange phrase to use about a city, but it captures something real. Cities make a promise to the people who choose to live in them. The promise New York has always made was specific and extraordinary. Come here, and you will find opportunity, energy, community, and a chance to build something. A business, a family, a life that rewards the effort you put into it. That promise attracted wave after wave of immigrants, migrants from other American cities and states, young people who arrived with nothing and built something real. The evidence that is accumulating in vacancy rates and shelter censuses and school enrollment projections and migration data suggests that for a growing share of the people who need that promise most, it is no longer being kept. Not because the city has lost its energy or its capacity for reinvention, but because the economic structure that surrounds it has shifted in ways that make the effort of staying harder and harder to justify. Cities have always changed. That is true. And New York City has survived changes that would have ended lesser cities. Fiscal crises, crime waves, disasters, disruptions of every kind. Its resilience is genuine and documented. But resilience is not the same as accessibility. A city can be dynamic and unaffordable simultaneously. It can be full of energy and still be emptying out the communities that generated that energy in the first place. The 12 signs we've walked through today are not predictions of collapse. They are observations of a drift. Slow, largely invisible to those experiencing it from inside it, but unmistakable when you step back and look at the full picture. The storefront that has been dark for 2 years. The family that packed up for Raleigh. The shelter intake center processing 133 families a day. The school that has fewer children than it had 5 years ago. The worker who cannot find an apartment she can afford on the salary the city pays her. These are not separate stories. They are one story, told 12 different ways. And the story is about what happens to a place when the people who make it work can no longer afford to live in it. If New York City is showing these 12 signs today, the next question worth asking is this: what happens to the cities that grow to absorb everyone New York is quietly sending away? What do the places that are receiving these families, their teachers, their nurses, their small business owners, do with the energy and experience that arrives at their doorstep? And is New York City paying attention to the answer?